To speak, and I use that title, "We're Not Talking About Lab Experiments," to reflect the fact that in a recent workshop that we ran as researchers with a network of local authority and district energy activists, one of the officers there came from Carbon Trust, brackets England, and he spontaneously, he had done the TINA study on heat. This is the person who, I can't remember what TINA stands for. It doesn't mean there is no alternative in this case. But he was quite shocked to hear the 25, 30 local authorities that we had represented in Sheffield Town Hall standing up and talking about the investments they were making in district energy, distributed generation, whatever you want to call it. And he said, "We're not talking about lab experiments here, are we?" It's kind of stuck with me. In other words, to the local actors who are part of the energy system and certainly part of the work to intervene in and engage with energy systems development in the UK, these are not lab experiments, these are difficult areas of project development and infrastructure investment that they're working on. And there are very diverse patterns in that sense of emerging governance practices in sustainable energy in the UK. But let me backtrack a little bit and say, why start with practice? Because the emphasis in the paper title was somewhat provocatively, I suppose, on practice. This isn't really in the paper, but I struggled with theory, and so I had to take a step back myself from the paper and think, why is it that I'm struggling with theory? One of the issues, I have to say, is because I get embarrassed as an academic in working with the local authority activists as well as policymakers at different levels of UK and European government that we are carrying out our research on. I get embarrassed by needing to explain to them what the value of academic work is and realise how difficult it is to develop theory that is useful for practitioners, or useful theory, if you like. Now that in itself, of course, is a very contested area. What constitutes useful theory for practice? But in my head and in my own way of working, to have value, theory really has to be responsive to practice. And I realised in reading actually Richard Sennett's latest book, Together, which is about cooperation and the history of cooperation, that my own practices, if you like, as an academic, and primarily working from a sociological and economic sociology of markets perspective, my own work model of theorising is that it's a kind of cooperative enterprise, and that's the way that we've approached this in the Heat and the City project. And I'm using that term dialogical methodology deliberately to distinguish it from the dialectical approach to theory, which I have been educated into in Britain, as most of us have, I think, across Northern Europe. We understand theory as argument, as a somewhat adversarial edge to it, whereas what we're engaging in through the collaborative research model that is practiced by the Heat and the City research project is much more this cooperative model of theory building. We are talking to interviewing theorisers, and they are theorisers from community level activists, social enterprises, right up to, haven't actually managed to get someone from Wall Street yet, but notionally certainly the financial investors that we're interviewing are, their understandings, their theories are shaped very powerfully by some of the major Wall Street investment banking kind of interests. So it's also trying to understand how to build theory out of those diverse perspectives, those often conflicting perspectives, and to pay respect without being duped, if you like, as an academic or a social theorist, to pay respect to those different perspectives, to understand the context in which they are embedded, literally, those socio-historical contexts, and also then to interpret, understanding practice in terms of that socio-historical context, or contexts in which practices are embedded, in which actors, complex actors, make sense of their own situation and rationalise about what they are doing and why they're doing it and how they're going to do it, and how to legitimise it, how to evaluate it. So it leads us into paying attention to actors as complex, as dispersed, the agency as dispersed, kind of actor network theory orientation, to ask questions about whose vocabularies, whose discourses become dominant and how are they dominant, why have they become dominant, and to what extent is work being done to disrupt those dominant discourses, and who are the initiators of that, who are the developers of alternative understandings. I hope academics are part of that, but what we're finding is there are a whole mass of theorisers out there about energy systems who are also in various ways and to various degrees disrupting the mainstream discourses of energy governance. And then what, as a sociologist, I have to come back to questions about what that tells us about societies and social change. And I'll try and move through this. One of the things that it tells us when you go this route in research terms and you ask questions about sustainable energy in the UK is that you get into some dangerous, rather dark territory and deep excavations. And the deep excavations in this case are material as well as symbolic, in the sense that's the street just around the corner from where I work. And lo and behold, you start doing research on heat networks in the UK and there's virtually none of them. And the University of Edinburgh starts digging up the streets for the first time in its history to invest in energy networks, combined heat and power systems, by digging up the streets. Now we already have a series of combined heat and power systems, but it's the first time that the university has actually broken into the main streets. There it is again, the street I work on, you can't get to work, you know, for these energy networks they're putting in. So that background then leads to conceptualising governance in terms of a problem of collective action. And the way in which the question, the research question behind the Heat in the City research project is to say, well, if we have this policy ambition for clean, affordable energy, I think there's plenty of textual evidence to say that we do have that. We have legislation. And some of those policy documents show that there is a recognition of the energy cost and carbon saving value of district energy, decentralised energy, particularly in urban areas, but the context is one of liberalised and centralised being part of the key there, I think, UK energy markets, finance capitalism, where relatively speaking, relatively mobile capital, deregulated financial markets. What emerges? Do we actually get the recognised value being created out of that cost, energy and carbon saving configuration of decentralised energy or not? And the argument again of the research project is, if that is going to emerge, the hypothesis is that it is most likely to emerge not at the level of small community groups, not at the level of central government, but through cities as complex actors. However, if you read any of the work on cities as agents of governance in late modern societies or whatever, finance capitalism of the Northern Hemisphere, whatever terminology you want to use, you'll realise that the UK is characterised as the state, the multinational state, that has the most centralised power at state level and the weakest system of local government across Europe. So people like Patrick McGowan, for instance, argue that most cities in Europe are perfectly competent as complex actors, particularly through their systems of local governance, but the UK has gone furthest in terms of that experiment in market mechanisms forced through the state as well as through its energy and financial markets. So what potential in the UK? Then this looks like the worst case to look at, the most extreme case, the most limiting case, to ask to what extent cities and city authorities, because they have so many of the relevant powers of governance over a territorial area, what can they actually achieve? Our project data, the paper is based predominantly on 15 interviews plus documentary analysis plus attendance at various meetings. The bigger picture, we have a 4-year project, we're in year 3 at the moment, is of a very significant data set that is being accumulated both through semi-structured interviews, through observation, through documentary analysis, through knowledge development with the Vanguard's network of something like 50 UK local authorities. And what we see in the UK case is of urban energy projects that emerge, led to some extent by, well, initiated by local authorities, not necessarily invested in significant financial sense by local authorities. What happens is where those projects develop, and this is, I think, Aberdeen, the development is patchy. Investment in urban energy systems where it makes sense. In other words, good economic case. I don't mean necessarily a good financial investment case, but a good economic case for combined heat and power and heat networks or district heating. Nevertheless, what actually happens is very much dependent on, saying this earlier, the presence of particular people. An enormous degree of serendipity. We were given an example in our project meeting just earlier this week, yesterday, Mark was there, where serendipity has determined that Glasgow, at the moment, just got a large amount of money. Strathclyde University is actually the holder of that money through Scottish Funding Council decisions to invest in in energy infrastructure across the higher education sector in Scotland. Serendipity will now dictate that there will be significant development there. So where there are the coming together of certain opportunistic political and economic opportunities with actors who understand the issues, who are already committed, then developments come along, but very patchy, responsive to those periodic finance and political opportunistic moments. Highly improvisatory solutions. So the 3 examples in the UK in the paper are of Aberdeen, non-profit company, benefit of citizens in its terms of in statement. Birmingham, totally different model, risk aversion, ambitions for local economic regeneration led the way as opposed to poverty reduction and amelioration. Pulled in a private partner who runs a special purpose vehicle providing energy for this city centre development. Woking, environmental politics led the way, executive leadership, highly committed at the centre, but a model that's committed to local enterprise as opposed to non-profit, but still locally owned and controlled. So that's the UK scene, and if you look across Europe, what the paper is asking is, well, in theory we have a liberalised energy market across Europe, but is it one liberalised energy market or many variants and references to the varieties of capitalism model many of you will recognise embedded in there. I would say that when we started the project, we did a comparison in year 1 between 3 countries that have supposedly similar liberalised energy markets. They had all got into privatisation relatively early, UK, Netherlands and Norway. And also they all had low levels of decentralised energy, low levels of combined heat and power and district heating or heat networks. We find the same discourse being deployed in those 3 countries then, about a liberalised energy market, a single energy market indeed. But in fact, when you look at the practice that sits behind that discourse, what you find is that it's quite contrasting. The Netherlands and Norway, who arguably have come out of a more coordinated model of capitalism, managed to overcome a lot of the difficulties of start-up of local establishment, local governance of energy that we're really still, I would say, struggling with in the UK. And there's a the activists that we've seen at local levels are really having to work very hard to try and resolve that struggle over the contested understandings of what is the value of doing this, what are the risks, who should carry the risks, how legitimate is the whole thing anyway, aren't they just being crazy? And so those different models obviously then have very different implications. So in the UK, what are the follow-on messages from that? Well, I've also been involved in a piece of work recently with the Department of Energy and Climate Change, who sponsored a group of us as part of their heat policy development to look at the barriers to deployment. So we went around looking for barriers. I found some in Birmingham. Barriers to their Christmas market. So, on the one hand, that's the liberalised model. The market will discover financial return where it's there. What you need to do for government, therefore, they have to address market barriers. So you've got to find some market barriers and address them. Except the ones that are cited by local authorities don't look very much like things you can fix through market means. They indeed look like, and indeed what most of our local authority activists would say is, well, there's no planning framework for this and we don't have a mandate and therefore there's no capital funding. So those look like areas for government action, prospectively. What kind of messages for governance for decentralised energy does that lead us into? Well, it begs questions, I think, an awful lot of questions, as you can see on this one, about changing the dominant frameworks of value and evaluation, the sociology of value question behind that, and in particular the arguments that are being rehearsed at local level by local authorities that we're working with are about value creation through local economic action, as opposed to the value extracting model that underlies much of the kind of neoliberal model of practice that we have in the UK. And then obviously what follows from that, well, how do we get there? We can say that as academics, we can make those arguments, but I think there are a whole series of unanswered questions that are very challenging. It all depends, is the answer in academic terms. Who will create that shift in regulatory parameters? I think the jury's out about to what extent city authorities, urban authorities in the UK can really lead that change despite ambitions being there, and I think growing ambitions. Where's the political will? It goes back to questions that Frank has been raising about where is civil society in all this, and where are the demands going to come from on the politicians to make